listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
The winner in Nigeria's presidential election has been announced, and it is Bola Tinubu. Also, the French are dealing with neo-colonialist policies getting rejected by West Africa. Joining us now to discuss these matters, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Tinubu, who had received the backing of the outgoing Buhari government, ran his 2023 presidential bid on a widespread get out the vote campaign, with the official slogan being, "It's my turn." You know, Dr. Horne, a lot of people were quite concerned that there were a number of State Department officials floating around Nigeria, causing great concern that they may be up to, shall we say, miscreant activity. Your thoughts on the outcome of the presidential election?
Well, as you probably know, opposition parties have challenged the results of this election. They have reported, among other things, that masked men have grabbed ballot boxes and scurried away into the night. Mr. Tinubu himself has had a checkered past. Like his predecessor, Mr. Buhari, it's unclear how old he is. He is apparently not in good health. He also has had legal problems with the United States, which helps to ensure that Washington has his claws in him. Washington has been quite adroit and adept with regard to Nigeria in playing off the three major ethnic groups against one another, speaking of the Hausa, the Yoruba, and the Igbo. And Mr. Tinubu is close to the Yoruba. So I'm not sure that the election results in Nigeria will withstand scrutiny. But in any case, it appears that Washington is not necessarily unhappy with the result.
Even if the results are able to withstand scrutiny, he's received 36% of the vote. And we know that there were a number of other parties that were vying for the position. So again, if the outcome is able to withstand scrutiny, will he be able to govern?
Well, the question is, was his predecessor able to govern? As you probably know, Nigeria has been racked with various kinds of unrest, including a religious insurgency in the north, including a spate of kidnappings, I'm afraid to say. And this kind of unrest has been manna from heaven for Washington, which would like to keep Nigeria off balance, off kilter, so it cannot play the muscular role on the continent that it was destined to play. We all know that Nigeria has enormous energy resources, and given the conflict between the North Atlantic countries and Russia, there is even more accentuation on the energy resources of Nigeria as a way to supplant the energy resources of Russia. So Mr. Tinubu has an uphill climb, and I'm not sure if he's capable of making that uphill climb.
And, my understanding was that the former state governor Peter Obi was a strong candidate, that people felt that he was somewhat, heard him described as somewhat like kind of a social democracy kind of person. Do you think he's the person that the U.S. was most concerned with possibly winning?
Well, I think that Washington could have lived with any of the three major candidates, the other one being Mr. Abubakar. Mr. Obi may have been third on that list, not least because he had stirred a certain amount of popularity. That is to say, he had engendered popularity with regard to the youth vote. And the youth have been quite active in Nigeria. Recall some months ago when they were protesting against various kinds of corruption and had taken to the streets. So at the end of the day, I think that Washington is not unhappy with the Tinubu result. And I do think that they could have lived with an Obi result as well.
There's another Sputnik article, New French Policy in Africa. Paris can't fully break from past rooted in colonialism. French President Emmanuel Macron revealed that his government was planning to reorganize the presence of French troops in Africa on Monday. Reorganize with a new security partnership Sounds like another form of colonialism. And I just say it would say this: with the amount of money that France is stealing from and the resources from Africa, I don't feel that they're going to easily just kind of wander away from all that looting. Your thoughts?
Well, as we speak, Mr. Macron has embarked on his 18th trip to Africa since 2017. Since Mr. Biden won in 2020, he has made 0 trips to Africa. What that should tell you is that there's a kind of division of labor amongst the North Atlantic countries, with France carrying the Africa portfolio. But as you know more than most, France has fallen down on the job, leading to rather distressed relations with Mali, amongst other nations, not to mention Guinea-Conakry and Burkina Faso, which are entering into a kind of confederation that could easily be characterized as anti-Paris. And at the same time, you've had the influx of Russian interests into those 3 West African nations in particular. And so Washington is beginning to wonder if France can do its job in terms of carrying this Africa portfolio, hence this trip of Mr. Macron, not to the 3 aforementioned countries, but to Republic of the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Gabon, Angola, etc. The latter 2 nations, once again, being energy rich. However, time might have passed France by. And I'm not sure if France will be able to recover from this changing global correlation of forces.
In this piece, they quote a Dr. Felix Endarinda, who honorary assistant professor at the University of Rwanda, who says that Paris cannot fully break away from the past when the past is rooted in colonialism. And then he goes on to say that the continent, which is the world's fastest growing region, is changing, and the people of Africa are leaving behind the narrow politics dictated by colonial legacy. And he then added that France has been criticized for exploitive relations and that they seek a more, quote unquote, balanced partnership. First of all, in terms of Paris can't fully break away from the past, well, I think it's incumbent upon the Africans to break away from the past. And this idea of a balanced partnership, in this instance, I don't think it's a mathematical equation. I think balance is relative. And what Macron and others seem to be trying to do is control from behind instead of being so far out front.
Well, certainly that's the case, and some of the preliminary signs are quite disturbing. I'm sure you've heard the distressing stories from Tunisia, a former client state, a present client state, in a matter of speaking, of France, where you have an unpopular president, Mr. Said, who has been waging virtual war upon the dark-skinned members of his population under the premise that they are refugees from south of the Sahara. Obviously, he's emulating his neighbor, Libya, which since the overthrow of Mr. Gaddafi in 2011 by the North Atlantic countries has embarked on a similar racist pattern. Once again, this is an unsustainable policy. Once again, it's unclear how long Mr. Said will be able to maintain his office given his anti-popular policy. And once again, what we're going to see, I'm afraid to say, is the increased incursion of AFRICOM, the Africa Command, into Africa in order to prop up these anti-popular regimes, not unlike what you have witnessed in Somalia. And in this regard, I'd point your listeners to a comprehensive article in the New York Times just yesterday about the U.S. operations, military operations in Somalia, which involves repetitive military strikes, which also involves assistance to the failed Saudi operation in neighboring Yemen just across the Red Sea, at the same time that Washington and France are resorting to the mailed fists in order to repress unrest in Africa. At the same time, they're complaining about China in particular, and how China is not playing fair by building infrastructure and by building the headquarters for the Center for Disease Control in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the Africa Center for the Disease Control, building railroads, etc. So once again, Washington really needs to get its act together, but don't bet on that happening.
In another interesting article, Politico's piece on the Russo-Franco competition in Africa ignores local countries' agency, and they talk about a political piece, how Moscow chased France out of Africa. Your thoughts?
Well, France has not been chased out of Africa altogether, but it's well on its way because of reasons outlined in the previous minutes in our conversation. I think that it's a reflection of the times. After all, 1960 was seen to be the year of Africa, when you had numerous African nations, including Nigeria, that come full circle, coming to independence. And 60 odd years later, you have the North Atlantic nations still trying to impose a kind of colonialism on Africa. And obviously, it's lived past the sell-by date. And that is one of the reasons why you see those articles, such as you just rendered with regard to Politico, concerning how France is being chased out of Africa, or in the process of being chased out of Africa.
And being chased out of Africa, that's an interesting description, because when you look at what China is bringing to the table, as you talked about, infrastructure development, when you look at what Russia has put on the table in terms of backing freedom movements, providing fertilizer, providing grain, and the United States provides coups, the United States provides involvement in elections and military intervention, the decision doesn't seem to be that difficult to make. And it also seems to be that's the direction that that these leaders in Africa are going.
That is certainly the direction, and you need to look no further than what we've been talking about on this program for the last few days, which is the fact that South Africa, in many ways the vanguard nation of the continent, has been engaged in military maneuvers with its BRICS partners, speaking of Russia and China, BRICS being Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That has caused consternation in Washington, as well as the fact that South Africa has been reluctant to collaborate with Washington and London and Canberra, Australia, with regard to destabilizing the neighboring regime in Zimbabwe because of its efforts to reverse the fruits of settler colonialism by reclaiming the land stolen illicitly by European invaders decades ago. So once again, the trajectory of Africa is coming into focus, and it does not necessarily envision a major role for the North Atlantic countries.
We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's also an author, historian, and researcher.